everybody. Welcome to our online class and to any visitors that have joined us today. I'm going to introduce our guest in a moment. We're very pleased to have Sarah Holland-Batt here with us. And I will do the preliminaries first, and then I will get out of your screen. My name's Belinda Castles. If you don't know me, I'm a lecturer in creative writing here at Sydney in the English department and coordinator of the creative writing program. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered on the unceded land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This talk today, this celebration of poetry, is part of a unit on the Masters of Creative Writing called Writers at Work. We're interested in the idea of writing as labour and the questions that arise from that. What kind of a worker is a writer? What kind of work do they do? How do they see the purpose, processes and responsibilities of their work? This week, I will be talking to the poet and aged care advocate and many other things beside, Sarah Holland-Batt, who has recently joined us in Sydney at the Charles Perkins Centre. Sarah is a poet, editor and critic and recipient of the Prime Minister's Literary Award for Poetry, among many prizes and shortlistings. Her poetry collections are Aria, The Hazards and The Jaguar, which is soon to be out, and her work has been translated into several languages. She's the first poet to be appointed the Charles Perkins Centre Writer in Residence, awarded annually to a writer offering a literary perspective on health and chronic disease, and is Professor of Creative Writing and Literary Studies at QUT. So I will welcome Sarah to the lectern and I will come out of the way. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's lovely to be here. Hello, everyone on Zoom, and hello, everyone in the room. Really delighted to be here.
Thank you for coming, Sarah. Sarah's got the busiest week I've ever heard of, so I'm very pleased you're here. And I thought perhaps you might start by reading us a poem, sure. Sarah.
Sure, I'd love to read you a poem. So, yeah, okay. This poem is called The Gift, and maybe I'll just read it and then we can talk about the context of it as the conversation unfolds. The Gift. In the garden, my father sits in his wheelchair, garlanded by summer hibiscus, like a saint in a 17th century cartouche. A flowering wreath buzzes around his head, passionate red. He holds the gift of death in his lap, small, oblong, wrapped in black. He has been waiting 17 years to open it and is impatient. When I ask how he is, my father cries. His crying comes as a visitation, the body squeezing tears from his ducts tenderly, as a nurse measuring drops of calamine from an amber bottle, as a teen at the car wash wringing a chamois of suds. It is a kind of miracle to see my father weeping this freely, weeping for what is owed him. How are you? I ask again, because his answer depends on an instant's microclimate. His moods bloom and retreat like an anemone as the cold currents whirl around him, crying 1 minute, sedate the next. But today, my father is disconsolate. I'm having a bad day, he says, and tries again. I'm having a bad year. I'm having a bad decade. I hate myself for noticing his poetry, the triplet that should not be beautiful to my ear, but is day, year, decade, scale of awful economy. I want to give him his present, but it is not mine to give. We sit as if mother and son on Christmas Eve, waiting for midnight to tick over, anticipating the moment we can open his present together. First, my father holding it up to his ear and shaking it, then me helping him peel back the paper, the weight of his death knocking. And once the box is unwrapped, it will be mine, I will carry the gift of his death endlessly. Every day I will know it opening in me.
Thank you so much, Sarah. What a beautiful opening for us. Before we get into the context of this work, this poetry that we've been thinking about, I wanted to reference your collection, Fishing for Lightning. So Sarah, we didn't have this on the reading this week, but I think it's a really wonderful book. It's a beautiful idea. It's a collection of columns that were published in the Weekend Australian over a year. And Sarah writes a little essay on an aspect of poetry and presents some poems from a particular poet that demonstrate those aspects of poetry. It's completely accessible. It doesn't dumb anything down. It approaches poets that might be thought of as difficult on occasion. But the collection together, I think, really gives us an insight into what poetry is for and who it might be for. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about those two things.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's quite odd to be asked to write a newspaper column about poetry. And in fact, that wasn't what I was asked to do. I was offered a column and they wanted me to write arts gossip, the sort of thing like whose book's been signed, who got what advance, that kind of thing. And I just said, that's not really my jam and no, thank you very much. And then I came back with a totally different proposal that I thought they were almost sure to shoot down, which was that I've always thought that people actually do like poetry, but they just don't know how to read it. And if they've been made to feel as though they're not confident with poetry, often in high school, it's taught a bit like an intelligence test. And if you don't get the poem the first time, there's something wrong with you. Poetry is not for you. And I speak to a lot of people who kind of feel that way. And I've always thought that actually, if you open the door just a little bit to people and give them a few of the strategies of what the poet's doing, or maybe some suggestions about how to read a poem, people actually do like poetry, and people who you think wouldn't like poetry really do like poetry. And I found that out writing a newspaper column where you get correspondence from everyone, not just people like the people in this room and on the Zoom, but, you know, people who are literary people. You also get emails from people who are gardeners and, you know, who work in construction but have happened to pick up the paper and read it. And so it was a really interesting exercise. And I sort of knew I was writing for a different audience than the audience that I often teach and speak to. And so, yeah, but nonetheless, it did connect with that audience. And so when I was thinking about how I would write those columns, I was thinking of my mum, who is, you know, like probably all of your mums, kind of a bit bewildered and sort of hopeful for your writing career, but not a great reader and not a literary person herself. And, you know, and so I was thinking about how over the years I've explained various things to mum that go on in the literary world, and everyone's nodding, and I know that you're all probably engaged in that with your own families. And so I didn't want to dumb it down to the audience, because I think actually, you know, that's a mistake that we can make in literature, to think that literature is only for people who have a certain type of knowledge or a certain vocabulary. And I think actually some of the letters that I got from readers showed me that readers who have no experience with poetry actually saw a lot in those poems, some things that I didn't see as well. So yeah, it was sort of came out of my belief that if you give people a little bit of an open door, that they actually do find a lot of joy in poetry. And I can't totally take credit for the idea, because there were a couple of really great poets, one in America who did it. So this amazing poet, I don't know if anyone in the room has read Robert Hass, really, really wonderful poet. He wrote a column for much longer than I did, but his was much shorter. So I think it kind of evens out. He wrote a couple of hundred words and I was banging out 1,200 words a week on the column, which is quite a lot when it's for publication. But yes, he wrote a great column for many years for the Washington Post, which was turned into a book. And then there was another UK poet, James Fenton, who wrote one for The Guardian. And so I had those in mind, and I just thought, you know, newspaper arts pages these days tend to focus on what books just come out, what advances have happened, the kind of newsy aspect of literature. And I thought there was a place for something a bit more contemplative. And so that was the sort of origin of the column and the thinking behind it. Does that kind of answer? Oh, and you were also asking the place of poetry in one's life, right? So I think it belongs in the newspaper. I think it belongs as an everyday part of life. I think the problem with the way poetry is perceived is that, well, you go into any bookshop and it's like a little tiny shelf up the back that you have to really look for. And then they've got kind of Shakespeare and Keats and not much contemporary stuff. And I think a newspaper, because it is really ordinary, because it is full of news and ordinary stuff, is kind of a great place to put poetry in so people can see it as part of an everyday kind of part of their life. And so in writing the columns, I was aware that people would be flipping through the paper and reading the finance pages and then coming to a poem, and tried to kind of time it with seasons, things that were happening in the news, as I was framing the poems for people to get a bit of a sense of how it might relate to what was going on in the world and in their life. That's probably enough on that. But
it was terrific. Yeah. I love the idea of the whole project. And when I was reading that book, I could not believe that you wrote one every week, because it's not just writing the essay, it's having read
it's reading the book,
the poetry as well, and maybe checking a few things
yes,
too.
Indeed.
So that sounds impressive. Okay, so just before we get into, so there's a sort of a subject as context in the readings that we've been looking at, which is aged care, the place of older people in society. But I thought just before that, we were considering, just before you came in, the quite large question of what poetry is for. Over to you.
Yeah, what it's for. I mean, I'm interested to know your views about what you think it's for, because I think there's a range of views on that. So some people see poetry, I think you can think of it as a spectrum from like activism to art for art's sake, and totally esoteric and just about the pure wild joy of language, and it doesn't matter if you have any readers. And maybe the other side of the spectrum is more interested, so I think, in connecting with the reader. So I think the first question to ask yourself, and everyone's got a different relationship with this, is, are you writing to a reader, or are you writing for a smaller echo chamber of people who know this very specific kind of language, this specific set of references? I think all of those are quite legitimate ways to think about poetry. I think personally, I am interested in a reader connecting with my poems, and you've read probably a couple of them, and you might have that sense that these are not totally esoteric poems full of references that you can't approach. But yeah, there are different schools of poetry. There are different approaches to that. My poetry potentially you could frame a little bit as confessional, in that there's a speaker who you might think is close to me or me in the poems. They're lyric poems, so they're usually about a single moment unfolding rather than an act of language or something like that. But then there are lots of different poets who have a totally different view on that. And I would totally and utterly defend the right of art to just be for its own sake. I don't think it has to have a purpose. I think some art does, some doesn't. When I think of my own poetry, I think it can perhaps illuminate elements of some of the stuff I write about in my essays and my public kind of criticism, but it's not serving exactly the same function because it's doing something aesthetic and artistic. And I think you have to have, in my view, you have to bring those qualities to poetry. I think poetry that's just saying a message without attention to music, language, metaphor, syntax, the line, the shape of the poem on the page often falls down. So I think I bring a kind of musical and aesthetic sensibility, but I do want my poem to reach a reader, and that's probably on the spectrum, maybe somewhere close to the middle, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I think it completely makes sense. Looking at the poems that we've read. I might just ask you a little bit more on that, because you said something interesting in Fishing for Lightning on political poetry, which seems timely. You wrote, even when the poet is a first-hand witness to the horror, there's the question of how to transform rage into poetry. Cri de coeur and the blunt language of slogans and chants might work well in the charged context of a rally, but they don't always resonate on the page. Moral outrage is a difficult emotion to corral into poetry, in part because it often borders speechlessness and incoherence or cliche. And so I wondered, these are not things I see in your poetry, but I would call it political. And I wondered whether you would call it that, and how you negotiate the pitfalls as you see them of political poetry?
I think it's a tough one. Like when you read a really great political poem, maybe you have one in mind. Maybe there's a poem you've heard where you think, yeah, that really nailed it. They're like 1 in a million. And for every one of those, there's sort of, 900,999, that are maybe really well intentioned and have maybe what you might think is a good message, but also, ultimately no one's going to remember them. And I think with poetry, the test for me is, do you remember a line? Is there something that stays with you? And is there something that you want to return to a second or third time, a fourth time, a fifth time, some particular way of putting language? So it's not just about the message, it's exactly about the vehicle of language. And this is the same for the prose writers in the room, right? A story can be as good as you want it to be, but it's all actually about the language and the way you shape that story. Language is your medium. It's like your clay if you're a sculptor, And so with a poem, it's not enough to have the good subject. It's all about precisely how you render it. And that's what makes a poem memorable. And ideally, as a poet, you want your poem to be remembered after your lifetime. Poets kind of don't write for an immediate mass audience. You're kind of writing for history. It's a different way of thinking. I don't know how many novelists there are in the room. It's a different kind of medium, a different kind of sense of who you're speaking to. So poetry has to have an immediacy in the moment that it's written, but some form of timelessness as well. And that's a little bit slightly of a different answer to your question. But I think the issue with political poetry is often it might resonate just in that moment, but a few years later, because often it will draw on slang, kind of phrases of the moment, ideas of the moment, and those can be quite ephemeral. When you're thinking about politics, when you're thinking about the way we think about things, that changes extremely quickly. And so to make a lasting political poem is very tough. There's a reason there aren't, anthologies of the great political poems of the 20th century. They'd be pretty short. They're very, very good, the ones that we do remember, but it's a challenge. I mean, you think about, I actually wrote my PhD partially on this topic, and I was looking at all the poems that were written. God, there's a lot of people in this room who might be a bit too young to remember, but I remember 9/11. That was when I was in university, at your age. I remember watching that on TV. And it's such a singular moment. Everyone in the world in some way felt that they were touched by that, if not directly affected, if not knowing anyone in New York or, in Washington, where the Pentagon crash was. Everyone felt that was maybe a bit like Ukraine. We're all watching it all the time and we feel acutely the pain and horror of what we're seeing. But finding a language that kind of lifts that from just saying, it's so terrible, isn't this awful, why won't someone do something? Finding a kind of moment and a language for that can resonate with an audience, it's a real challenge. It's really, really tough.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean you don't try. But it just means you've got to be willing to fail quite a lot before you get the good one. Yeah.
I think a moment is an interesting word, an interesting way of thinking about that. We were thinking a little bit about this before and thinking about if, for example, you were to write a poem on climate change, what your access would be. And moment seems like a useful word as well. As what is it that you want to capture that will resonate if you are speaking to eternity. That sounds like a lot of pressure, Sarah, for the poets.
No pressure. I mean, you think about a poet like Yeats. Yeats only wrote a couple of great political poems, and he's Yeats. Some of the great poets who we love wrote no political poems, and that's okay too. Really, as a poet, I remember a mentor said to me a long time ago, you're looking to write about 2 or 3 really great poems across a career. And that's all, you only need one. You actually only need one really, really great poem that everyone remembers. You think about someone like Allen Ginsberg. I mean, I've read all of Allen Ginsberg, but all anyone remembers is Howl. And that will be a great poem, for as long as poetry is read. So funnily enough, a lot of the poets who we think of as the hugest names, we actually remember like 5 or 6 of their poems, but they're just really fantastic and they're centuries old. So, there's also like a no pressure. It's sort of like you won't actually know what is the one if you write the one, because you'll be dead. And so you just got to sort of publish them across your lifetime, cross your fingers and hope that something might survive you. But it's also nice to have readers in this lifetime. Let's not just focus on, the future. But I think part of what I'm saying here is that the nice thing about working in poetry as a medium is there's not the huge commercial pressures that there can be on writers writing non-fiction or memoir or, fiction, where if you have a dud novel or something, these days it can be tough to get a publisher to go in and give you a second novel or a third book. And particularly when you reach mid-career, you've had like 2 or 3 books that have done okay, but nothing kind of stand out. That can be a really tough place for a writer in those genres. Poetry, you do have the somewhat liberating thing that most publishers who publish it are not publishing it for commercial imperatives. They're publishing it because they believe it's important. It's an important art. And so in that sense, there's somewhat less pressure on poets.
Yes.
Yeah.
We novelists think of the poets as the idealists.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Don't have to get dirty. We've been looking at 2 different modes of your writing. Your essay in the Griffith Review about aged care. It seemed to be centred on an idea of society's failure of the imagination about getting old. It imagines lots of things through dystopias and the like, but does not look the fact in the face that if we survive, we get old. And that's usually a deterioration of some kind. And we've been looking at your poems. I think all the poems that we looked at had your father as a subject. I am reading you into the confessional mode there. And so in these different kinds of writing, we're in the same realm. And I suppose it's part of the reason that we read these poems as some form of you. But you're using language in very different ways, presumably with a different purpose. And I was wondering about how you access the language you need for those 2 different modes, and what the different purpose is when you're producing those pieces of writing.
Yeah, so I write across a quite bewildering array of different literary modes at the moment that I never sort of thought I would. I always just wanted to be a poet and, had to write the essays for my various graduate degrees, and I just thought, that's it, that's me done for prose. And then here I am writing all sorts of things, op-eds and essays and whatever, which just goes to show when you find your subject, whatever that is, and, you guys are at the start of a master's degree, you might think, and there'll be something that gets its hooks into you. And for me, it's sort of quite a personal topic of ageing and aged care, because my dad had quite bad experiences in the residential aged care system. And I think a lot of people over the last few years with the lockdowns and grandparents and so forth have had a bit more sense of just what's going on in there. But yes, that sort of prompted me to move beyond my natural mode. Weirdly, my natural mode is poetry. That's kind of how my brain thinks. I'm interested in poetry, always interested in condensing. And like I said, finding the precise way of saying a thing, not just saying a thing, but the exact words. And that can take a lot of time. And it's all about pressurizing language and kind of, in a sense, hardening into a single shape, an idea that could move in various ways. When you start a poem, you might think it's going to go in one direction, and a good poet won't just end in that direction. You should sort of follow various roads, and as you kind of narrow it down, the poem takes its shape. Most poems don't end where I think they're going to end when I start the poem, and that would be a typical kind of process, I think, for most creative writers. With essays and with opinion writing, which I do a lot as well, which is a different thing again, that's like, I write for The Guardian or The Australian or various kind of news organisations, writing an op-ed. That's kind of the epitome of persuasive writing, where you actually want to start with the idea, then you want to illustrate it. I'm sure you guys have heard of the inverted kind of pyramid, that principle of journalism. We start with the top line information, and then you kind of move down to the smaller information. And with an op-ed, really, it's all about punch in the first paragraph and then moving through that idea. With an essay, you can meander a bit, but you've got to have a sort of idea guiding you. And that essay, the Magical Thinking essay, was born out of a lot of different thoughts that I'd been having, and they probably come through in the essay. I'd been thinking about the things people had been saying to me about ageing, because I'd been starting to talk to people. The more I'd researched into the aged care system, the more horrified I'd become. I'd sort of tell people things, and then they'd all tell me the same thing back, like, oh yes, no, it's so terrible, but I'm just going to kill myself, I'll never go into an aged care home, or, you know, I'm just going to pay someone to look after me when I get old, I'm never going to go into an aged care home, or I'm just going to die in my bed. And I was thinking, oh, that's, you know, very specific decision that you've made about a future that you actually have no control over. You know, and so the more that people sort of repeated this stuff to me, I was thinking, there's like a collective delusion societally that we're labouring under, which is that it's terrible that it happens to those people, but those are people over there and they'll never be us. And there's something to me like quite evolutionary about it when you think to survive and to have belief in your survival, you can't really concede to yourself that one day you'll be frail or old, you know, that in a way as young people or youngish people, now for me, you know, we believe ultimately that, you know, we're going to feel like this forever. But the reality is, of course, like I watched my dad, he was like I am now, you know, when he was younger. I watched that happen to someone who was really brilliant, really bright. He had a PhD in thermodynamics. He was as smart as you could get, you know, and he still fell into this system because he got Parkinson's disease. And so I started thinking about that collective delusion, then researching it, reading about literary ways that we've thought about aging, because that interested me too. Like, how do we imagine that state of being old and vulnerable? Like, we don't want to. You know, if I said to all of you now, take a moment and imagine yourself in an aged care home, there's something in your brain that makes you not want to even do that for an instant, isn't there? I'm looking, everyone's kind of nodding at me. No one wants to do it. You know, and then we think, but there are 200,000 people in that system right now who are real people, you know, who are like our grandparents, potentially our parents, potentially us one day. So there's a big hurdle there. And in a sense, it's a very unsexy topic. No one wants to talk about it. No one wants to think or write about it. So in writing an essay, you have to kind of, in a way, find a way to seduce the reader into reading about it. And that was another challenge of writing that essay, because I know a lot of people just go, oh, aging, oh no, I can't deal with that. It's too sad or it's too terrible. I just can't read about that. And so it is a challenging, particularly challenging topic. It's not quite taboo. I wouldn't say it's taboo, but it's kind of in that realm of things that people really resist thinking about. And so it does pose particular writing challenges. And so I'd say I do draw on literary elements of kind of drawing someone in, poetic aspects of language, like in the opening and closing of that essay, and even in the structure of it, there's quite deliberate attempts to kind of draw the reader in to something that they would much rather kind of turn the page on and forget, you know?
Yeah, I found it really interesting the way, one of the ways for me that happened in the essay was that anecdote about what people say about aging, because I've heard all those things. Some of them from my mother. You just think, I don't know how to organise these things for your mum. And, you know, and these things will come to get me as well. And, but in the poetry, and perhaps because of my particular tendencies in reading, I thought the essay was so powerful, but the thing that really, I just found the poetry so moving. And for me, that was the access point to the experience. And so I was very interested in the different ways that you create those experiences. In some ways, about the same thing. It seems as though, so when you talk about the failure of the imagination, and then we read those poems, you're being called upon to imagine, to not to imagine in an abstract way, but to enter,
to see it,
the experience. The one person, which seems, I think our brains somehow can do that more readily. Here is one person with characteristics and history and relationship with the person in front of him. And it just seemed this sort of beautifully demonstrative example, having these two modes of writing, of accessing a subject. And I was saying before you came that you could imagine a different person writing these two things. So I was interested in that approach. Maybe what we could do, I'm just going to say for the people here in the room and on the Zoom room, if they can hear me, that there will be time for questions. I am keeping an eye on the clock, so I will open it up probably in about 10 minutes. But I thought maybe you could read us another poem, Sarah.
Sure, I will. And I just to pick up on something you just said, one of the things that poetry can do so well is make you see it. And I'm really deeply interested in as a poet in the image, and that's probably come through in the poems that you've read. And I think it's kind of an incredible trick a writer can do to make a reader see something in their mind. And in a poem, you want them to see the most accurate version of that thing. You know, if I say apple, you'll see everyone will just unbidden see a version of that in their head. And I've always just thought it's an incredible trick. And when you think about experiences that you'd like to resist imagining, it is a really great tool, the poem in particular. And just one further thing on poetry versus prose in that way. Poetry, lyric poetry, the type I write, usually is centered on a moment, a kind of a scene or a day or just an instant. And I think, you know, in describing something faithfully and imaginatively, you know, using the power of metaphor, which is about bringing something other than what you're seeing into that world and helping to explain it that way, can be a way of accessing the empathy for the other. If I just described things in these poems exactly as they are, with no call on the visual imagination, I think they wouldn't work as well. So I think it is kind of part of using image, using the palette that you have as a writer. Anyway, so speaking of that, I'll either of these could work to illustrate that actually, but I'll read this poem, which kind of is what we'd call in poetry as an extended metaphor. It's kind of one metaphor that you know, you kind of take a metaphor and then spin it out for the remainder of the poem. So this is My Father as a Giant Koi. My father is at the bottom of a pond, perfecting the art of the circle. He is guiding the mottled zeppelin of his body in a single unceasing turn, like a monorail running on greased steel, like an ice skater swerving on a blade, turning and turning at a continuous angle. His scales are lava and ember dappled with carbon. His tail, a luxurious Japanese fan. He is so far beneath the green skin of duckweed, he cannot make me out, or I him. What he knows is shrinking into round facts, days like mossed stones, each the same weight, spears of water hyacinth rising around him like jail bars, reek of peat. He has been down there for years, ancient god of the dark, keeper of the single koan, moving in currents only he can sense, fluent as a windsock. He surfaces 3 times a day when the nurse brings a tray, cold blanched carrot and beef, white sauce fillet of whiting, pound cake. He cannot trust the scratched headlamps of his eyes, so he navigates by feel, craning his huge whiskered head mouth first towards the fork, weaving like an adder charmed by smoke. And then he clamps down to find the world suddenly there again, solid as metal and bait.
Thank you so much. I was just thinking, it's funny how this happens in your brain when something is being read aloud, but that was making me think of the poem. I think is it Pike by Ted Hughes? Yeah. With the whiskers and the sort of the physicality of the fish. And then the experience of the poem brings those other experiences of other poems into it as well.
Of course, yeah. It's a great poem. I love Ted Hughes.
Yeah.
I love Ted Hughes.
There was a kind of an idea in your essay that made me think of poetry as well. So you were talking about the way that old people are viewed as useless in society, and that perhaps this is part of the failure of the imagination. We live in this kind of instrumental kind of thinking where you have to have some kind of value,
economic purpose.
Yeah. And so I thought this was so interesting for a poet to be saying this, because this is
because poets have no economic purpose.
They have no economic purpose. But statistically, the odd one does. Mostly not.
Yeah.
So I wondered if you could talk about that. You seem to be saying something about the world we live in where these things are not valued.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all saw it. I don't know how many people in here read the paper on the regular. I have the misfortune of having to do that because I'm so involved in aged care policy, so I have to follow it all the time. And over the last few years during the pandemic, what has been covert in the way that we think about older people has become overt. So, you know, certain opinion writers across all the papers, it has to be said, have been writing things, and economists in particular, and I don't know, several economists who've been on Q&A have given economists a bad name over the last Gigi, you know, arguing that actually lives have a relative value, you know, overtly saying that, you know, well, we can't really value an old person's life as much as a young person's life because the young person has a lot more longer to live, a lot more to give to the community, they're economically productive, an older person is essentially going to die anyway. That's the kind of implication. No, I mean, people have almost said that. Even the Prime Minister kind of said that, said about aged care residents that they were pre-palliative. There's 200,000 people who live in aged care. On average, people live in there for 2.61 years. They're not dying immediately. A lot of them have the right to live and live well while they're in there. And some people live in there for decades. So to write off an entire demographic of people and say, pre-palliative is not a medical term. Doctors don't use that. That's just a term that communicates to the general public the notion that these are people who somehow exist on the threshold of life and death. They're somehow not as valuable as a young and healthy person. That kind of discourse became very overt during the pandemic. But, you know, as I've kind of argued in the essay, it's been around since ancient Greece, and, you know, it's an old idea, the idea that, you know, you reach your use-by date and after that you're not as valuable to society. Not all cultures, it must be said, think this way, and some cultures are fantastic at looking after elders and older people. But, you know, the culture that we live in Australia is not. And sorry, what was the question? I've gotten onto like...
So I thought it was interesting. Maybe it's just in my head that a poet would
have
writing
about this.
About uselessness.
That's right.
In this particular society.
That's right. I mean, you know, poetry is something that has no use, but then, of course, a lot of the things that have no instrumental use are still really valuable to us. You know, music, for example, is exquisite and we all love it. It doesn't do anything. I mean, I get really tired, actually, I have to say, of the arts always demonstrating its value only through this really tired economic argument. I think it's actually the wrong way to say what the value of the arts is. The arts is never going to compete with heavy industry or something like that, you know, to make an economic argument for itself. But the argument it should make for itself is that it's good for humanity and that it shows us who we are and it challenges who we are. It can be really provocative. You know, it can challenge our thinking in various ways, and that there's a great inherent value in that. And I would just say not all value is economic. And I think that can be the mistake that we make in these arguments, defending what we do in this room, just putting it in economic terms and saying, oh, well, the arts contributes X number of dollars to the economy. Yes, it does, but it also has a kind of immeasurable worth to us as a society. And so I think, you know, wisdom, life experience perhaps sits in that kind of realm of something that you can't quite quantify the value of what an old person could tell you if you sat and listened to them. But, you know, I've had experiences like that in Dad's nursing home, because you get to know, I don't know if anyone in this room has a loved one in a nursing home, but, you know, you get to know not just the carers, but some of the other people who live around them, and you get to know their stories a bit. And there's an incredible wealth of humanity and knowledge and dignity and personhood in the people who live in aged care. And so to see it kind of boiled down to economics, to me, is a total failure of imagination. And we do this all the time, not just with people who are older and in aged care. We do it with people living with disabilities. We do it with a range of different people, minorities in various ways. The idea of relative worth and worth only being measured in economic terms, I think, is something that the arts can challenge through these narratives that we can tell that can move us into perhaps moving a little bit closer to understanding or valuing the life of someone who's unlike us. And I think you know, that's something that only art can do, really.
Yeah. It's sort of circular and difficult to argue for the intrinsic value of things, you know, that people are valuable because they are people, even if they can't express their value, they just are valuable.
And I think there's a human. I've been trying to use the language of human rights about what's going on in aged care, because we think of human rights as something, again, that for some reason unfolds overseas and that it's about humanitarian crises. But, you know, we do have challenges with human rights, the right to dignity, the right to good and safe care, the right to have someone come and help you when you need it. These are human rights as well. And it doesn't matter how sick you are or how old you are, you should have these inherent rights. So that's another way of thinking about it. It's not just about value, it's also about rights.
And that's perhaps a way to argue, you know, when you have to have the argument.
Yeah, when you have to argue.
Okay, so just before we go to questions, I thought it would be really interesting to hear about what your project is at the Charles Perkins Centre. You know, why are you here with us?
Yes, why am I here with you? So my project is, I'm actually working, I've got 2 projects, which is my mistake. I'm always working on like 20 projects, but I'm writing a book of non-fiction essays / memoir about Dad's experiences. And the challenge will be exactly all of what I've talked about. And you've kind of read in miniature in the essay, but with his Parkinson's. So people think of Parkinson's as just a motor disease. So they think it's about tremors and having difficulty walking and, you know, hands trembling and stuff like that. People don't realise that Parkinson's can come with really quite stunning personality changes as well. And Dad experienced like the most mega personality change, became a totally different person. And it's probably too long a story to tell now, but the sort of nub of it is about that question. The nub of that book is about, where does our personality reside? What makes us us? Because we like to think that's quite a fixed idea, that I'll still be myself when I'm 80, I'll still be myself when I'm 60, that somehow we have this baseline. And it's quite unnerving to think that actually what we think of personality can be a sort of little cluster of chemicals, that when that's actually unsettled, we can become other to ourselves. And so that's the kind of idea that I'm interested in there. And there's some quite wild things that happened along the path of Dad. He had Parkinson's for 20 years and it progressed really, really slowly because he kept really intellectually active. So he was teaching himself how to play harmonica. He was composing concertos like 10 years into his Parkinson's. He was a really, really bright guy, had a million hobbies. And so he stayed intellectually active enough for a long time that we saw a really quite wild trajectory. So it's sort of about that. And then the second thing is another book of poems about the challenge of imagining death. So it's all really cheery, really, really cheery topic. But, you know, I find this actually intellectually interesting. Like the harder something is to write about, the more interesting the challenge is for me. I think there's certain things that I would find really easy to write about. But I do like the intellectual challenge of these topics that people would like to look away from, and trying to find a bit of a language for those. Yeah. So yeah, I'm working on a book of poems and a kind of non-fiction book / memoir, undecided genre. We'll see how that kind of shakes out. Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, I don't know. Can you see anything on the chat there, Sarah? Has anyone?
I don't. I can't actually see. Oh no, there's the chat. No, I don't. Oh no, hang on. We do have some comments. But I don't think we have any questions.
Okay, so it's just comments at the moment. Does anybody have any questions in the room to start us off for Sarah?
Please don't be shy.
How did you get approached to be involved with the aged care?
I didn't. So it's an interesting thing. You put in a submission. So when they have a Royal Commission, it's basically a giant public inquiry. And if you've had bad experiences, you write a kind of narrative of your experiences. Dad had really, really atrocious experiences, and like experiences that involved me going to the police, the regulator. Like I'd done the whole thing. As a very well-educated and competent person, I might add, like tried to get justice for him and a resolution, and failed to do that. And because I'm a bit like a dog with a bone, I was like, okay, well, if we can't do it through those channels, we'll do it through this one. And so you write what's called a general submission. They just open to the public to write their narratives. And so I wrote that. And then it's kind of up to they have a bunch of solicitors and barristers who read through all of those submissions. And then they approach various people to write up a version of it. And then you go through this, like, it's absolutely hideous. You go through this gigantic process of all of these conference calls with like 8 lawyers going, was it on the Tuesday or was it on the Friday that this happened? And when did you get that email? And can you actually dig up the medical records of when he was at the hospital and da, 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 da. It's kind of like it is exactly preparing to be a witness kind of in a court case. And so I said yes when I was approached to do that. But it was actually quite nerve-wracking because in a sense it's quite exposing to be willing to become a public voice like that. I wouldn't have done it if I hadn't satisfied myself that this was going to happen again. Like the way the system is set up, it's set up for Dad's experience to be replicated for all of your parents and all of you. You know, it's just fundamentally there's a failure in the way that a person can complain, can have their rights upheld, all of that. And so I could see all of that because I'd done my very, very best to pursue it. And so I remember the night before I was going to testify and, you know, they gave me a call the day before and said, oh, by the way, you know, occasionally there's media who catch you on the way out of court. And that hadn't even dawned on me. I just sort of thought, oh gosh, you know, it's if you're a private-ish person, as a writer, you're never totally private, but, you know, I hadn't done a lot of public speaking on personal topics like that before. And then I thought, oh my God, they could have mentioned this, like the exposure kind of element of it sooner than the night before. But it was kind of too late at that point because you get a summons and you then have to go once they've taken you through it. So it was past the point of return. But then I thought kind of in for a penny, in for a pound. Like if I've done the testimony, then I was asked to write pieces and I just thought, why not? And then actually I really got interested in the topic, which sounds insane. Like I've read all of the white papers on aged care. I've read all of the inquiries, all of that stuff. And the more you read, the more interested you become in the detail of the policy, what the government's doing, what they could be doing, what the recommendations have been, you know, all of that stuff. So I don't regret it. But yeah, it all came out of just a public submission, just literally writing about what had happened to Dad and how terrible I thought it was and how unfair and how the system had failed him. And so yeah, it's just one of those things. You don't really realise a few years later now, I'm going, oh my God, you know, the stuff that I never thought it would lead to what I'm doing now, but also don't regret it.
Yeah, it's a sort of a moment when you are called upon to speak.
Yeah, and you sort of think, actually, it's kind of great to do it as a young person because this is a group of people who are siloed, you know, from general society. They live in a home where they can't leave. They don't have much of a voice. We never hear from aged care residents on TV. Like, when is the last time you've heard one of them being interviewed about how they feel about COVID lockdowns? You don't hear that voice. And so I recognised as someone who, while I hadn't done a lot of public speaking on that topic, had done a lot of, you know, I'm a lecturer, like I've done a lot of speaking, I'm confident communicating. And I thought actually it's kind of the role. And you think about the bardic role of the poet, you know, that term bard, like Shakespeare the bard, that sort of means the public role of the poet, that this is something they like to think about a lot more in the Renaissance than we think about now, but this idea that the poet can show you the truth of the society that you live in and kind of play that jester role of showing you the truth, but showing its slant. And I sort of thought it's kind of right as a poet that you should do this, is what I would say to myself before I'd go and do insane things like go on television with the aged care minister. But
yeah,
anyway, it's my life now.
Yeah.
And I don't really regret it, you know.
Yeah. It came to you.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions in the room? I'm just having a look at the chat as well. There's one here, Sarah.
Can I describe my editing process for poetry? How do you harden the ideas into a completed poem? The short answer to this, and this is good advice for the prose writers in the room, read out loud, read everything you write out loud, read every sentence that you write out loud. You will hear the moments, like it's like the sort of when you bite into an oyster and there's like a piece of sand still in there. Like you'll find those kinds of moments where the sentence is jagged, where it doesn't work. Poetry has to has to move in a way. And of course you can write poems that don't, and that are all about, you know, the jagged, unsettling kind of quality of language. That's fine too. For me, I'm interested in a poem that is hard and tight, and that involves reading it out loud a lot. And it also involves challenging your ideas. So inevitably, thinking about that metaphorical imagination, inevitably the first metaphor or image that comes to mind is not very good, like 9 times out of 10 for me. And I'll sort of write it down. I'll go, oh yeah, that's okay. And then you have to kind of go, it's actually not good enough. And what else could it be? What else could that thing be like? The game of the poet is ultimately likening things that are unlike. You know, to summon up that image, you've really got to push past the first impulse that you have and the second impulse and try and find something a bit original. And then, you know, read a lot of poetry to learn how to edit. Like, see how poems land, see how poems begin. And you can, in many ways, from poets who you admire, from poets who you love, you can learn editing from the way that their lines work, the way their enjambments work, the way their images are phrased, their rhetoric, their syntax, the shape of their stanzas. You know, it's all kind of fair game, and it's all good lessons in editing as well. So yeah, read out loud, push past the first idea, and read other people's work more than you read your own. You know, that's the best advice I can give. I think we've got a general question. Have you seen any patterns or changes in my practice since I've become more politically active? I'm thinking generatively, capacity to write, quality, etc. It's a good question. No, I'm still sort of like a slow writer. So it's been 6 years between all of my books, and I'm very happy with that as a poet. I tend to like the poets who only write one book a decade or a book every 5 years rather than the ones who write one every sort of 6 months. And I still would say the poems come slow, the good poems come slow. And poetry, just as you're all about condensing the lines in an individual poem, you're also about condensing the poems that you bother publishing in a book. So I write a lot of poems that don't make it into the book. For every book, I've probably got 2 or 3 books worth of poems that no one will ever see the light of day, because we don't have archives anymore. So no one can, you know, bring out my papers and produce all of the sort of second quality poems that I don't want read, because they're all on my computer and no one will find them. So that's good. But yeah, I think it is about being selective. The political kind of writing or the opinion writing and that sort of stuff, you do have to be generative and you do have to be quick. You would not believe how short some of those deadlines are. Like, sometimes you get a call from an editor at, you know, midday, and they're like, can we have it back by 2 p.m? You know, for the next day's paper. It's a totally, for a poet, it was like absolutely terrifying to suddenly be operating in that sphere, because I'm used to being incredibly precious about language, as you can probably tell. And so suddenly having to produce large quantity of writing in a very short time. Same with the column though. I mean, it sounds doable, but I had to read a book every week and select a poem and then go to the publisher and get permissions to republish the poem for the paper, and then write 1,200 words, edit it and file it, and then start the whole business again, you know, every week for a year. It teaches you a different discipline. And I would say don't shy away from that. Like, writers can often be very precious, myself included, but it is good discipline. If you ever get a gig that involves a lot of writing and writing quickly, you learn a lot from that as well. It's never as perfect as it would be if you took a month to write it, but it's still a good discipline as a writer. And I always think journalists, you know, often are the best novelists because they have that discipline. You know, you think about like Graham Greene or someone, those novels are terrific and they're so condensed and tight because he was just churning out copy all the time, and you learn a lot from that. So, but yeah, it hasn't changed how I write poems really at all. I hope that answers that question. Nick?
Are there any questions in the room?
Oh, just really big one. You talk about AI poetry, like in one art way, or public eye. Has that been very personal therapeutic for you? Processing, you know,
It can be. Yeah, therapeutic is maybe not my experience, but I would say there's something satisfying in finding a language for something, and often it can just be, you know, those moments in your life where you're kind of haunted by them and you're not sure why. And I had a lot of those with Dad in the last few years of his life and in the last week of his life. There were just these little moments in the hospital where I thought, I just knew I was going to remember that for the rest of my life, and I couldn't work out why. And for me, I don't sort of write the poem immediately after that moment, but if you still keep returning to that moment and sort of thinking, what is it about that? This is hilarious. For people on Zoom, we're being accompanied by a choir if they can't hear it quite through the mic. But those moments, it's just very, very difficult to speak with. But you do kind of come back to those moments and work them through in the poem. And I think there've been certain experiences like that where I've actually gone, oh, that's what it was about that, or you work out why it was bothering you or why it's kind of haunting you. And it doesn't mean you don't return to that moment, but it does mean you've sort of found a language for it. Does that kind of make sense? I think a lot of people do find it very therapeutic. But when you have therapeutic writing, often it's all about your immediate emotions and like just getting it out. And that doesn't always translate to the reader, yeah.
Or if you realize that you feel like you practice that frame or world again.
Actually, I find it better. I don't write a journal, which is sort of sacrilege because I know we're supposed to tell creative writing students, write every day. I would say write when you want to write. It's probably really bad advice to a bunch of master's students who've got to turn out a thesis. But no, I don't write a journal, but I've got lots of friends who do, and they find that very helpful. And they can actually look, it would have been helpful with the lawyers at the Royal Commission if I'd kept a journal. They're saying which Tuesday, and I'm going, oh no, I have to go through my email, but I don't. I actually just write when I'm in the mood to write. And often it's sort of like the question you asked, it's something that is niggling at me, and then I might have a little bit of time to sit down and write. And it takes me a really long time to write a poem. It takes me like 8 months or a year to finish a poem. Like I'll just sort of start with an idea, leave it in a folder on my computer, return to it, read it, keep thinking about it. I get a lot of writing done on walks. I go for a walk, a big long walk every day. And kind of in my head, I'll be thinking about something, an image or something might come to me. That's sort of like my journaling, is just walking and thinking. And yeah, Murakami has a good book about, he's a runner. I'm a bit lazier, but some kind of repetitive exercise often can be the moment where those ideas come to me. But journaling, I think, do you write a journal?
Yes and no.
I think that's fine. I'd go with that. Write when you're in the mood to write, because there's nothing worse than the poem that you write or the writing that you write when you feel you should be writing. I don't know if you have that experience, Belinda, but that's the worst time to write, when you think, oh God, I've got to do some writing. It was never very good. Yes, please.
I'm just sweeping in briefly here to say goodbye to the Zoom class. Thank you so much for tuning in, for your questions, for listening. What a fabulous talk. I believe I did record it, so we can spend some more time over it later. I'll say goodbye to the Zoom class. Thank you for tuning in.
Hi,
Let
everyone.
Sarah
Thanks
say
for joining
goodbye.
us. Thank you.